Hello, YouTube. It's been a while since I've made a video last time. Today I was going through my fountain pen collection a little bit with my girlfriend. We ended up pulling out quite a few pens, and I noticed that I had several of them inked up that I wasn't aware of. They've been sitting in my pen case for a little too long, and it looks like several of them need to be cleaned. So that's what we're going to do today. The whiskey of choice that I'm drinking today is Oban single malt Scotch whiskey, aged 14 years. It's pretty smooth. As you can see, I've enjoyed it quite a lot. We've got several pens to go through today, and I'll tell you a little bit about the pens, how I acquired them, and a little bit of the history that I know of them, and anything that's unique about them. Does that work for you? Perfect. Put this off to the side. Let's put it over there. This is my Pentel, as you can tell. I've had it for a few years, needless to say. It's been around the block a couple times. Here's a less used towel that I still use for inking and whatnot. It's been through the wash. This one definitely needs to go through the wash. The way I'm going to go about cleaning pens today is pretty simple. Here I have a jar of water, straight from the tap. Nothing really special about it. It's just water. Some people say that you should use distilled water when cleaning pens. And I can admire that, but I choose not to. It's fine. I haven't noticed any problems. The reason you'd use distilled water over normal tap water is so that you don't have any of the chemicals or the fluoride or anything of that nature ending up inside the pen. But it's pretty nominal, and again, I've been doing this for years and I haven't had a problem, so we'll just go ahead and proceed like normal. This first pen we're going to go ahead and clean is my blue Parker vacuumatic. It is the standard model. You'll see these kind of everywhere. The date code reads, it's right off to the side right here. You can, it might be a little bit hard to tell, but this little dot, that's actually a number 5. And that stands for 1945. There's going to be a dot on either side of this number, and it's quite a pinhole, and that's going to tell you the quarter of 1945 in which it was made. I don't recall what side represents what quarter, so all I know is it's made sometime in 1945. It's a war pen. The thing about these vacuumatics is during the war they had to save precious resources for the war efforts. As a result, this plunger was originally aluminum or metal. And during the war they made it out of plastic to save on the metal. The rest of the vacuumatic mechanism that's in here, which consists of a spring, a diaphragm, and I don't know what you'd call it, but it's like a little metal, it's a thing that's inside there. And how this works is when you push this, the diaphragm kind of pushes down, expels air out through a breather tube, and then upon this releasing the button, the spring retracts it and sucks up ink, thus filling the barrel rather than an ink sac with ink, and holding I think it was 47% more ink, if I remember the advertisements of the day. The Parker Vacuumatic was a very iconic and well-made pen at the time. Came in a variety of different sizes and colors. I currently own 2. I have owned 3. One of my very first vintage pens was a Parker Vacuumatic. It was in the gray striations. It's semi-transparent. You can see through it, and that's so you can check the ink level. The thing that's really nice about Vacuumatics is even though it has, at the time, one of the more complicated filling mechanisms, it was a very reliable pen. It posts very nicely. It fits in the hand very well. And it writes exceptionally. So how we're going to flush this out is we're just going to circulate some water through here a couple of times. You can see the ink coming out. I'm going to get it so it's relatively clear. It doesn't need to be perfect. I've got several pens to do. That'll do. The way we're going to dry it, I've been doing, is we're going to get a bowl. And I've lined it with a paper towel. And what I do is I just keep the nib pointing on the paper towel and just lightly post the cap on top of the pen. And that should hopefully draw out the majority of the ink. let this sit overnight. Speaking of pens, that came into my hands recently during my collecting days. This is a Waterman's Lady Patricia, and I believe the color was called Sunburst Red or Sunset Red. I don't remember which one it was, one of those two. It's made out of celluloid, which at the time was nothing unusual. You don't usually get stuff made out of celluloid today because of one small little problem. You see, celluloid is explosive. It's combustible, I should say. I know this because I have direct experience with this property of celluloid. I was naive. I was in college. It was I want to say it was either my second or third year. I was in the dorms doing my collection thing. And I'm going to go back to this, because this is made out of celluloid, the vacuumatic. In order to remove this section, I need to remove this for repair. And at the time I had Frank Dubel's The Book. And I have since learned that you shouldn't use the book as gospel. In the book, they instruct you to heat this with an alcohol lamp to soften the shellac or the adhesive which keeps the filler mechanism in place. Being my naive self, I used a cigarette lighter, thinking none of it. Within a few seconds of me applying a flame to the back end of one of my vacuumatics, it spontaneously deflagrated in my face. Notice I used the word deflagrated rather than detonated. It was kind of more of a whoosh. Like when you light gasoline, that's kind of it's not a bang, it's more of a whoo, if you understand what I mean. Anyhow, it did that, and I was able to get it out like within a second, but the pen was now permanently damaged because of it. I still own that pen, but it is now in the parts bin because of that. Luckily, I didn't spend much money on it, and these pens you can get for relatively cheap. You shouldn't spend, like for this exact model, I think you shouldn't spend any more than probably $100. But I find them at flea markets all the time for $10. Maybe under $50. You shouldn't have to spend too much for them. They're pretty readily available, and they're very good writers. This was my first pen, my earliest surviving vintage pen, I should say. This was in direct competition with Parker's vacuumatic filling system. Parker released the vacuumatic filling system sometime in the early 30s. Waterman was dragging their feet at the time in the late 20s. And at the time, their pens were quite antiquated at the time due to the newfound injection molded machines, and pens were becoming more vibrant and more fun colored, while Waterman pens still kept on looking like a stick, a black stick, such as this. Waterman eventually did catch up with the patrician lineup, starting, I believe, in the late 20s or early 30s. I do not own a patrician. They are quite expensive. They're about $1,000. They're very beautiful pens. They're made out of celluloid, and they have this beautiful iridescent look to them, especially under the sun or under great lighting. Hopefully you can see. Anyhow, Waterman came out in the mid-30s. I think it was 30, I want to say 33 or 34. A year or two after Parker released their vacuumatic filling system, Waterman came out with their inkview system. That's this thing right here. The inkview system functions more or less like how the diaphragm works, or how the vacuumatic works, I should say. What's in this little section right here is an ink bladder. And when you depress the ink bladder like this, I'm not going to do it because it's filled with ink, but when you push on this, like the vacuumatic, it will force air out through a breather tube that runs through the center of the pen barrel. And then upon releasing the lever, the ink sac is allowed to open back up and draw in ink as a result. And the reason we were after this was because before this time, pens were using levers and buttons and whatnot, and using these very limited ink sacs to hold ink, and they were very sensitive to temperature, humidity, all that stuff, and it didn't hold as much ink as one wanted. So this was a way to get through that. And this was called the inkview system, or the inkview lever. I haven't written this pen in at least a couple months, so we do really need to flush this pen. But you can notice how beautiful and gorgeous it is. I should also note that when you buy these pens, they don't come with this white lettering. That's something that I like to do on my pens. When you fill in the engraving in here, it makes it just a little bit easier to read. By a little, I mean a lot. The way you achieve this is usually you get a China marker, and you kind of swirl it in there. And this, by the way, is not permanent. This will eventually come out, but it does the job done. It does the job well. And then you wipe off the excess, and then what you're left with is it filled up like this. It's quite a lot of ink in here. I don't remember what ink I used to fill this with. It may have been diamine onyx black, I'm suspecting. I don't know though. Let's see about flushing it out. It's a nice mechanism, though, the way that the Waterman designed it. Even if it was a bit rushed, it works well. Though it was not fun to repair and get working, I can tell you that much. I won't go into details, but yeah. We might be able to reuse the water. It's just a flushing medium just to get most of the ink out. Again, doesn't need to be perfect, but just most of it. It's fine. Otherwise, this video will be here for hours and hours and hours. There we go. For cases like this, sometimes I'd use my ultrasonic cleaner. I have two of them, actually. What an ultrasonic cleaner does is, if you're not aware, it's a device that you fill with water. You plug into the wall. You stick something in there that you want cleaned. And what it'll do is it'll vibrate the water at a certain frequency, and what that does is it basically shakes off any oils or dirt or debris that may be on the item itself. The reason I have two of them is one of them is a small hobby grade ultrasonic cleaner, no bigger than about this big, and can fit things as large as like a CD. It's about that big for if there's any kids that are watching. I'm sure that there are, and you guys are aware of what CDs are, but us older folk like to pick on you guys about that kind of stuff. So my other one is quite large. It sits next to my kitchen sink. It holds about I want to say 5 or 6 liters. It has a heater and has a lid that you put on it. It will clean stuff. It shakes things a little bit more violently in there. It buzzes, and I only use that for if I'm going to do like a whole lot of pen parts or whatnot at once. But you have to be careful what you put inside ultrasonic cleaners. Ultrasonic cleaners can definitely damage certain items that are soft and porous, because it will basically force the water into those things and can stress them or fade certain materials. So you have to be careful. This is a Waterman's, what is it? It's a 0554. I bought this at a pen show some years back. It is 14 karat gold filled as opposed to solid gold. Gold filled means that there's a thicker layer of gold sheet that is wrapped around a base metal and then chemically bonded to the base metal. And what this does is it is a lot more robust of a gold coating than plating, like gold plating, which can rub off. It's only like a few atoms thick. gold-filled items typically cost more because the process of adhering gold onto a base metal is a bit more expensive than just gold plating, along with the obvious fact that it uses more gold content as well, thus raising the price. This is a lever-filled pen from the 1920s. It's a Waterman's. It's got a number 4 size nib on here. The coding system for Waterman's is, you have to learn it. Usually I'm still learning it, but the last digit is the nib size of the pen. So if it's a 4 in this case, it is a number 4 size nib. If it's a number 2, it's a number 2 size nib, etc. I don't believe this pen needs to be cleaned. I could be wrong though. I think it's fine. I'll put that off to the side. This is a Parker Duofold Junior. It's a later model of the Duofold. The Duofold was a very popular, well-advertised pen at the time, the Roaring '20s. Like all the pens at the time that were black or ornate, this was actually had some color to it that was still quite expensive at the time. I'll just pull up the other one, the spoiler. Your classic Parker Duofold Senior, or what they nicknamed the Big Red. This was a $7 pen in 1920, I want to say 1923, somewhere around there. They came in a bunch of different colors. The red was the most popular. It's the most advertised. You see them in advertisements all the time. It's certainly far from the rarest variant. I have 3 or 4 of the senior duofolds that I found at flea markets and estate sales throughout my life. I always pick them up even if they're not in great condition, if the price is right. I mean, unfortunately, they're getting very expensive now. I understand they were really expensive back in the day, $7. I don't know what the inflation rate is, and especially in the year 2023, things have kind of gotten a little crazy. But these are fantastic pens. The nib I've put on this pen, though, is not the nib that came with the pen. It's going to be kind of hard to see. But it's a two-tone Parker Challenger nib that I got off from a pen somewhere. I can't remember. And put it on here because it was... it just seemed to fit, and it was nice, though I don't write with this pen. I can write, though. I think it's filled. Yeah, the ink sacs in there. This is a button filler, by the way. You obviously unscrew this, and this button, there's a pressure bar inside here and an ink sac, and when you push the button, it kind of collapses the pressure bar, lets it bend and bow outwards, and then press into the ink sac to fill the ink, to fill the pen with ink. This one is clean, so I'll just let it the side. Oh, I should also mention, yeah, this is also a Parker. This is also a Parker duofold Junior. This is an earlier model of the Junior. It's in black. The main difference on the surface is the later model has a tapered cap ever so slightly near the base or the top. While the older model was a straight cap. See if you can see that. See that? It reads on here, duofold Junior, Geo or George Stafford, I don't remember his middle name, Parker. Fountain pen, Janesville, Wisconsin. Patent date of April 25th, 1911. I think that's for the feed. The Christmas tree feed. I could be wrong though. Lucky Curve, that's referring to the feed. I don't think this one has a sack in there. Let me check. No, this one doesn't, so I can unscrew this and show you. There that goes. Yeah, this is more of a parts pen, if nothing else. It's a project pen. This one has it cut off, but the Lucky Curve feed of the duofold would curve around and and have itself pressed against the ink sac, inside of the ink sac. And the idea of this, if I can recall, is that capillary action will draw ink away from the nib of the pen when it was not in use, thus preventing leaks. Though, from my experience and from most collectors, the system didn't really work as intended, so a common thing that people do is cut off the Christmas tree end of it. I personally have a problem with that because it doesn't do any good doing that, but I just leave it alone. I don't try to modify it. These are all fine. It's a very simple but elegant and recognizable pen. It's a big pen as well. It's a senior size, and oversized pens at the time were generally quite expensive. Oversized pens were advertised for men, and it was kind of a status symbol at the time. The bigger your pen, the more wealth you had, the more power you had, the more authority you had. It was just a subtle flex, so to speak. Nowadays, big pens are just fun. That's why I like them. They're just fun. This is a non-abrasive polishing cloth, and I'm just getting some of the gunk off of the nib. You have to be careful when you're doing this to two-tone nibs because you could accidentally polish off the plating, but this isn't two-tone, so we're okay. There you go. That's nice. I really like the grip section of the Parker Duofold Senior. It looks simple, but it feels so natural and so nice. It stops your fingers from rolling down, and it's just such a good size. I've always had a soft spot for duofolds. They're not the most remarkable or spectacular pens, but they just work really well. They feel so adaptable to your hand, and they're just so well balanced and so well made, and I can't speak highly enough about the design. The design does stem a little bit from the jackknife model that came several years before the duofold was released. But yeah, I just love this pen. This model is fantastic. A little bit of whiskey. This is a Schaefer number 6. I'm guessing it's probably from around 1917 to 1919 or 1920. It's an early Schaefer. Schaefer started business sometime around 1909 or 1911. I don't remember the exact dates, but somewhere around there. Schaefer's claim to fame was the lever filler. Before Schaefer, the way you'd fill a pen, well, there was numerous ways you'd fill a pen. A common filling mechanism, which wasn't really a mechanism, it was just a design, was an eyedropper filled pen. I don't have one on the table with me, but it's pretty easy to illustrate. In order to fill the pen, this whole barrel was hollow, and you'd unscrew the grip section, get an eyedropper, and fill the entire barrel with ink. It was simple. It was easy to manufacture. No moving parts at all. The issue, though, is in order to fill the pen, you had to have an eyedropper. And you had to be very careful filling it. And very easy to make a little mistake and then to get ink all over your hand and all over everything. And people didn't like that. People didn't like that. So throughout the I want to say from like 1890 to really the end of the golden age of fountain pens, up until we had cartridges, that was kind of what did it. Was cartridges, well, before I get to that, but throughout that time, companies were experimenting left and right with different ways to fill a pen, and it's fascinating. It's really interesting. They're always trying all these different new things. You can kind of think of it like in the tech world with like our phones, for example, and how new companies are trying out different gadgets and different things to, like the fold phones that we have. So they're experimenting with all these different ideas to make things, to make them more appealing to us consumers. But in pens, they were kind of doing the same thing, where they're just experimenting with filling mechanisms. So the lever was quite revolutionary because it fit inside the barrel. It didn't stick out like Conklin's crescent fillers did. It wasn't weird. It wasn't like a pump filler that Waterman patented. That I do own one. We'll see that in a future video. But it laid flush. It was an elegant and easy to operate design. And everybody tried to take up shop with that, but unfortunately you couldn't. And Waterman got into a little bit of hot water. On Waterman pens of the time, you'll notice this little metal casing surrounding the lever itself. This lever box served no real function to the lever itself. Schaefer's lever, it was integrated directly into the barrel of the pen, whereas Waterman's was kind of a unit, a separate unit that you kind of installed into the pen. And the reason Waterman did this was to bypass the patent design of Schaefer. But once the patent ran out, pretty much everyone was, copying the lever. Every pen pretty much had a lever at that point. They still did offer pens, eyedropper pens, in the catalogs in the 20s. They still offered all these different pens depending on what you liked. So it wasn't like everyone switched over to the lever-filled pens. They were just kind of the new self-filling pens of the day is what they're called. And well, I guess we're on this pen. PSF. I know SF stands for self-filler. I think P stands for pocket, but I could be wrong. Can't imagine this easily fitting out pocket. This is a number 18, the predecessor to the 58. We'll get to this in a sec. I found this pen when I was in Colorado several years back, and I found it as just a shell. It didn't come with a nib. So I spent many years looking for an original nib throughout eBay and whatnot. I couldn't find one, but what I did replace this nib with was a number 7 Waterman's Ideal keyhole nib, which was, I'd say, of equal quality. I don't think anyone who would own this pen would be disappointed with this nib instead of a number 6. I mean, I looked. They do pop up, but I wanted to write with it so bad that I just couldn't help myself. So I spent a little bit of money and got this nib, and I'm happy with the pen. I heat set it as well. So, and it writes really nicely. And it fits in the hand really well as well. The one thing about this pen is that the threads don't catch as easily as they could on the inside of the barrel, so there's a tiny little strip of tape that's just gives a little bit of purchase to the threads so you can close it. And just do a quick wipe down. Nothing major, just to make sure it's a little bit shiny, just to wipe off all the oils and fingerprints. When I got the pen, it was definitely used. I mean, the clip, yeah, it's got a little bit of corrosion right there. I mean, this is how I got it, but I mean, give it a break. It was 100 years old. It's not going to exactly be in mint condition unless you get really lucky. It's okay, we still have these pens though. If you're liking this video, by the way, I guess I should mention that there's a button down there. It's called subscribe. And it's not just there to look cool. It's there so you can click it. Follow me more on my pen adventures, as I'm planning on doing more of these. So if you like what you see so far, or if you're drifting off to sleep, whatever, I wish you well. Hope you're Go ahead and hit that subscribe. So let's come to this big boy right here. This is a Waterman 18, but it's really a 58. If you handed this to any collector, they'd call it a 58. The 5 designating that it's a lever felt pen. The 8 telling you that's a number size 8 nib. It's a big boy. I traded this pen reluctantly at a pen meetup. So that was a trade. I didn't pay for this pen. It was a trade deal. I traded a really nice other Waterman. It was like an early eyedropper overlay Watermans for this one. Big part of me misses that overlay Watermans that I used to own. And that Waterman I found for $40 at a flea market years and years ago. I told myself I'd never trade that pen away unless I found something spectacular, because it was so rare. It's so hard to find pens like that for such the price I got. But I just didn't find myself using that pen because it was so fancy and so ornate. If I ever get my hands on one of those again, I'm definitely gonna hold on to it, not trade it away. It looks like that when I got it, looks like the clip was reapplied. These rivets are definitely Restorer rivets. They're much flatter and much more flush than the I don't have an example. I guess I could show you this example. They stick out, so it's very obvious that they were restored at some point. This pen is filled and I'm still actively using it, so we're not going to clean this pen. Not a fountain pen, but a pen that I own. Imagine many of you recognize this model of pen. It's a Montblanc Meisterstück rollerball. It's a very elegant, simple design. Again, found this at a flea market for pretty cheap. It's real, from as far as I can tell. I've owned several Montblancs and it feels real. It's kind of hard to describe how you can tell if one's real or not, but the build quality is, when you feel it in the hand, it'll feel well machined, well made. There's no sharp mold edges to it or anything. I imagine the most expensive part of this pen is this part of brass or whatever it's made out of, this metal grip section. It seems to be machined out of one single piece of brass or some kind of metal. So it's quite heavy. It centers all the weights near your hand and your fingers. And as a result, it kind of it naturally slows your hand down a little bit and allows you to make more swooshing, curvy lines because of Newton's law of inertia. Physics, science. Montblanc is known today as a luxury company. They've done very well to market themselves throughout their history, as they didn't really revolutionize anything in the pen world. They simply just made great pens, and they marketed themselves very proactively, even up until this day. Here's the other Montblanc I own. This is a 149. I think everyone's got to have one of these at some point in their collection if they can afford it, or they get lucky finding it like I did. It's kind of iconic, I'd say. Nib is a two-tone nib. The outside is gold, well, the whole thing is gold, but the outside is gold and the inside is, I want to say it's either platinum or palladium. I don't know which one though, but it's very ornately engraved. It says 4810, which is the height in meters of the Montblanc mountain in France. It's going to be hard to show you on camera, but there's an M inside there. It says that's the M, the Montblanc M in a circle. Underneath it, it has 18K, which stands for the gold content. The word Montblanc, a 750, which stands for 75% gold, which is what 18 karat is. If it was 14 karat, it would say 585, which stands for 58.5. This is a piston-filled pen that I have filled right now. I'm not going to clean it out because I just filled it last week. But this section, you just unscrew it, it pushes out the ink, and it's just a plunger basically. Well, it's a piston. It's called a piston filler. But yeah. There you have it. It's, again, the cigar shape and everything. This is what you'd see in like executive signing, like fancy documents and whatnot. So it's a nice show-off pen. It's very classy. It's nice, elegant design that's been around for decades now. For those who find this pen a little too big and girthy, they do make the 146, which is a slimmer model. It's not as prominent, but it might be more comfortable to use as a daily writer. This is a Parker 51. If you ever collect fountain pens, a 51 is a must in your collection. No pen in history has ever been so iconic, so well loved. So versatile, so relevant. Than the 51, so reliable. I'll admit the 51 is not my favorite model, but credit to where its credit's due. It's, the engineering behind this pen is immaculate. It doesn't look spectacular on the outside, but what's on the inside is a different story. Yes. I could be wrong, but I think the 51 was the first hooded nib. The nib is covered by the grip section, and this serves several functions. The 51 came out, I believe, in 1941 during the war. I could be wrong, it may have come out after the war. I'm pretty sure it came out in 41. It was designed to be more streamlined, like the new locomotives and cars were starting to become a little bit more streamlined as well. So the 51 fit right in with the times at the time. The hooded design not only prevents you from accidentally touching the nib, the ink on the nib right here, like your traditional pen would over here. The hood also prevented the ink from drying out too quickly. So you could leave the pen uncapped for an extended period of time. And the ink will have, you won't have an issue with hard starting. The drawback to the hooded nib is that you lost flexibility in the nib itself. But that wasn't such a big deal. To us pen aficionados, we always like flex nibs. Soft nibs that like to spring open and allow nice contrasting line variation. But with a new generation of people who wrote and didn't know how to use flex nibs like they were meant to, like dip pens that required a very light touch. Fountain pens required just a little bit heavier of a touch. And because of that, people often broke flex nibs, the soft nibs of the day. And because Parker and Waterman's and all the other companies usually had a lifetime guarantee or warranty, they were losing money replacing people's broken nibs. I believe the duofold was the first what we call manifold nib that was mass produced specifically for this reason. This was the nib that you got. It was a manifold nib. It didn't have flex nib options, from what I can recall. You of course could vary the points. You could have a broad point, a fine point, a medium, whatever you want. But there's very little give in these nibs. And the reason they didn't give was because they're a lot tougher. They couldn't break. Thus, the companies didn't lose money over that. Having to replace everyone's flex nib when it sprung too far out. And the 51 came with several filling mechanisms. Oh, this one's a little bit stiff. I can tell I haven't used this in a while. This one is the vacuumatic that we saw earlier on the Parker vacuumatic. Later, Parker would release a 51 version with a what they called an aerometric converter. It was a rather simple mechanism. It was basically an ink sac, more or less, and it was permanently attached to the pen. And there's a pressure bar that you unscrew the barrel and you just push it. So it was kind of a bit of a throwback in that regard. I'm not sure if they released them side by side or they abandoned one filling mechanism over the other. It should be fine. Yeah, there's quite a bit more ink in there than I thought. Okay. Well, the 51 is so beloved today because it is so reliable. The thing that makes the Parker 51 so reliable is the feed. If you were to take apart the hood and look inside the pen itself, you'd see a very intricate feed that was attached to the nib. There is a lot more fins that allowed excess ink to expand upon. When you're holding a pen, the heat of your hand, or even the weather outside, a contrast, a temperature change will usually expel ink out of the pen. There was no way to control that. That was just the temperature of your hands, especially on a cold day. That was the worst. If it was a cold day or cold morning and you pulled out your Parker, and within a few minutes it would start leaking. So this is why you often see, I don't know, let me find, I think this is okay. No. Use my Montblanc. This is why on feeds you see all these little fins. That's so when you do inevitably heat up the ink and the ink comes out, it doesn't come out the tip of the nib. It actually comes out right here. It collects right here. Capillary action holds it all here. And then when you cap the pen, it'll drain back into the pen. And the hood keeps all the ink from rushing and splattering all over everywhere. It keeps it all contained. I personally have never had a Parker 51 leak on me. I'm sure it has happened, but to other people. But as most of them can say, it's a very reliable pen. And the funny thing is that Parker released a throwback version of the 51, I believe in 2019. It was not taken very well, the design. The new model was a screw cap. The original was a slip cap. It was very nice. So there's nothing necessarily wrong about screw caps, but don't fix something that ain't broke. The filling mechanism was different. The design, the price was kind of the big determining factor. You can get Parker 51s for pretty inexpensively because they're so readily available. People collect all the colors and all the different variations there are to them. It's not hard to collect 51s if you wanted to. So people didn't really see a reason to buy the new model when even companies like in China, like Hero or Jinhao, make knockoff 51s that are better than what modern Parker can make today. If you want quality, just get a vintage one. They're made in the USA. Unfortunately, we don't make them like that anymore. I'll let this one sit in the bowl over here. This was a recent acquisition of mine. This is a Parker 75. I found this at a antique shop sometime, was it earlier this year? I think it was earlier this year, actually. I didn't pay too much for it. Came with its box, too. It's a modern pen, relatively speaking. It was made, it ran for, I want to say 60s to the 80s, I want to say. I have no idea. I'm guessing this is probably 70s, perhaps. It's really hard to tell. Yeah, after the ballpoint took over the world in the mid-50s, fountain pens went by the wayside, and, well, they all kind of started looking the same after that point. It's kind of hard to tell when pens were made if you really don't know what you're looking for. This pen does have a unique feature. You'll see a little zero and some tick marks there. The idea is that you can customize the tilt of the nib by simply rotating it. Gives you a little bit of variability, because it forces you into this triangular grip. I personally just keep it on, keep it centered. And you would think that this wobbles around. It doesn't. You think it's loose. It's not at all. It writes quite nicely. This is an aerometric converter. And again, it's basically an ink sac shrouded by a thin metal pressure bar that you just depress and fill up. It's nothing too spectacular, but it works. It gets the job done. Parker 75. Sterling silver, very nice design. It's kind of the last, one of the last models that was really iconic from Parker's lineup. Parker's not really they're a former shell of their past self. I can't really recommend any of the pen models that they produce nowadays. And once you pick up a vintage pen, you start writing with it, you realize the quality is so much nicer. And I mean, these are tools. These are tools that you had to get the job done. This pen is filled up, so I'm going to put it here. Let's do this one. Yeah. This one's had a unique story. So the pen body itself is a Paramount. It's a really nice, beautiful blue lapis color. If I remember correctly, Paramount, I think, was a subsidiary of Wall Eversharp, but I could be wrong. And these were their second-tier pens. But make no mistake, the nib I put in this pen is worth significantly more than the pen body itself. That's right. That is a Waterman's music nib. And oh boy, did I spend a lot of money on this nib. I've been after a Waterman's music nib for close to 10 years. When I got the opportunity to get one, I sprang on it. As many of you know, I'm a musician, a composer myself. Currently I teach music, and one of my big interests is the tools to write music with. The reason Waterman's music nibs are so expensive, so rare, is that these were custom at the time. You had to go into a music store or your stationery store and specifically order a music nib, which costs, I think it cost about twice as much as the normal nib at the time. So it was definitely a splurge. It was an investment. And the only people that would use music nibs were either copyists, engravers, or composers. And there proportionally aren't very many of us, even at the time. So it just makes these just so rare and so sought after. Why they're sought after? Well, what people like to do is, the reason there's 2 channels in here is because that allows twice as much ink, and the flexibility is also very nice on these nibs. Music nib needs to flex in order to achieve to mark diacritical markings. Allows you to produce note heads easily, rests easily, slurs easily. All that can be done with the music nib. I did have a Waterman 55 that I've had that would, I mean, this is a number 5 size nib. The issue it had was that it, in that model, it just was so slightly off, and one of the tines was just misaligned slightly, and it would kind of give it a little bit of a tooth, a little bit of a scratch. And it was a very unpleasant writing experience for such an expensive nib, so I decided to put into this one, see how it wrote, and it wrote flawlessly, and well, it's going to live in this thing ever since. It's still inked up, so we're going to leave it off to the side. We have 5 more pens to go through. I know this video is getting long, but hopefully you're asleep by now. This is a Eversharp Doric, if I recall. I found this earlier this year. I think I paid $20 for it. It's not a full-size Doric, and I actually don't own a full-size Doric. This is, I think, a junior model or a ladies model, one of those two. I didn't really do my research on this, but it was in pretty rough shape externally. This band had very heavy corrosion around it. It was so heavy that I actually had to get a polishing stick and sand it off to get to the metal under here, and I'm actually not quite sure if this is the base metal or the filled metal. It could be a little bit of both, but I did the best I can to make it look shiny. I do know for a fact that this clip was gold plated because the water must have gotten into this and corroded it away, because half of the the fill just peeled off. The filling just peeled right off. It's not stuck on there at all. So this is the base metal. It looks like it's brass or something. I don't think it's brass. It must be a harder metal. Brass might be too soft. I'm not quite sure. You can see it's got all these straight sides. 30s or 40s, somewhere around there is when this pen was made. But the real goodness of this pen comes from the nib. This is what got me really excited. Check it out. That, my friend, is the Wall Eversharp adjustable nib. I've wanted one of these for a long time. I always thought they were cool. This little mechanism on here changes the flexibility of the pen. You can, it's really hard to do. There you go. You push it all the way up. It becomes the firmest nib, or we call a nail, and this is useful for doing stuff like carbon copies. And you can adjust it any variable in between, and if you push it all the way down, it becomes a very soft flex nib. I usually leave it somewhere in between. But this is a number 3 size nib. They usually came in a little bit larger sizes. But I'm just happy to have one of these. They're quite a lot of fun. It's currently inked up, so we're going to leave it off to the side. I think most of the rest of these we don't need to clean out, but we're coming down to the home stretch. This is an Edison, not the modern Edison pens that you have today. This was a different company. I don't know really much about them, though. From what I can recall, they were kind of a one-off company that kind of took a bunch of different parts from different manufacturers and kind of just made pens to sell in the 20s and 30s. I'm guessing this is from the 20s, maybe. I really don't know. You can see it says Edison Pen Company, Pittsburgh, Virginia. I did make one slight modification to this pen, in that I put a music nib on here that I found years and years ago. In fact, this was my first music nib that I found. I remember I found it in an antique shop, and I was going through the pens, and I didn't think anything of them. They just looked like junk pens at the time. And I uncapped one of the pens that didn't look that spectacular on the outside, but then I saw it was a music nib. I instantly recognized it. I gasped. I couldn't believe it. I thought I'd never see a music nib out in the wild again, because they're such specialty nibs. But I found one. It was, I think I paid $10 for the pen. It is an incredibly smooth writer, I can tell you that much. When held at the right angle, it feels, smooth as glass. The one caveat, well, I'll give you a couple caveats to this nib. It does not flex like a music nib ought to. It says it's non-corrosive, even though the plating has at this point come off. It used to be gold-plated, but yeah, it's got like little music note designs on there. I don't know if you can tell, but it's kind of cool. The width of the nib is slightly too large for most of my staff paper, so it doesn't make it a very practical pen for engraving or composing. If I had to guess, I'm guessing this nib was more suited for jazz hand, the style of jazz, because they read on larger staves typically, or most classical music is written on very small, typically smaller staves. So I'm guessing the width is more tailored to jazz notation than classical. Speaking of manuscript paper, I have at least, and I'm not even making this up, at least 40 pounds of vintage staff paper that I inherited from a colleague, a retired professor, well, a professor who passed away in my schools. And he left behind a whole bunch of music, just blank staff paper. And that's the only thing I use when I compose, because the staff paper, the vintage staff paper is actually very, very robust. It's very thick, it's very smooth, and it doesn't feather, or it's very forgiving for fountain pens. So I only use that paper. I don't use any of the cheap made in China stuff, unfortunately. I have to use good paper for composing. But I've got 50 pounds of it, so I don't think I'll be running out anytime soon. Three more to go. Here we have a Cross Townsend. It's a modern pen. You can pick these up today. They're nothing special. They're quite sizable, and their history is pretty substantial. The Cross Townsend has been, well, Cross has issued out pens to the U.S. presidents to sign various documents and bills and whatnot. Of course, they don't use fountain pens anymore. At least a certain president used Sharpie, like as if you're a football player, getting like your jersey signed. So, anyhow, we use roller balls and ballpoints now, but for a while, Cross supplied pens to the White House, and the model was usually a Townsend. This pen is substantial. Not only is it long, it's also quite heavy. It was not really made, in my opinion, with comfort in mind. When you post the pen, the center of mass is shifted all the way to the cap, and it falls out of your hand so easily. It always feels like it's on the brink of falling out of your hand. So, like that. Even going back 100 years, when you posted a pen, you didn't have that problem. the cap was light enough where it wasn't an issue. I could just do this and it was fine. Or if I do it with this one and just relax my hand a little bit, it just wants to tip out. At least they weren't skimping out on materials, that's for sure, but you really want to concentrate most of the mass near the grip section, not the cap. The cap itself feels very heavy, unusually heavy. Heavy pens are not great for long writing sessions. They're great for signing a couple things and a quick note, but apart from that, you really don't want something that's heavy. This is why pens made in the past that were meant for writing were made out of light materials, so that it wasn't as fatiguing to write with. Vintage pens have this advantage over modern pens most of the time. But there are a lot of good modern pens that are great writers too. Cross Townsend is unfortunately not one of them, in my opinion. Two more to go. This is a unmarked pen. You may or may not like the design on it. But it conceals a very nifty nib underneath. Let's take a look. That is, in fact, made out of glass. This is a glass fountain pen. Now, why on earth would you make a fountain pen out of glass? Well, glass pens have actually had quite a long history. They've dated back sometime to, I believe, the 1600s as dip pens, and they're usually very ornamental, but they do function. Putting a glass nib in a fountain pen seems like a bad idea. And in turn, it really was. But before the bad idea came up, they did make glass pens for a short bit of time, in the mid to late 20s. And they made these to cut costs on pens. They could advertise that a pen writes as smooth as a gold nib, but costs 3 times less. The other nice thing about glass pens, the advantage they had was that you could write at any angle. You didn't have to position it. You didn't have any skill. There's a bunch of different channels, flutes that the ink runs down the nib with. It goes to the point. So if one ink channel ran out, you can just turn it slightly and then keep writing. And it's neat to write with. It's a novel thing, that's for sure. The big glass manufacturer was Spores, which imported their glass nibs from Japan, if I recall. I do have 2 of those, but we'll look at those in another video. Of course, these didn't last long because, well, they broke if you dropped them or if anything happened to them. They didn't flex, and over time they would kind of dull and get a bit annoying. The other big thing is that they dried out pretty quickly because the surface area of the ink is quite large. It's really, a lot of it's exposed to the air, so if you weren't writing for a couple minutes, the whole pen would just dry out and you'd have to sit there with a tissue or something to get the ink flying again, where you just had to manipulate the lever. It just wasn't practical. And our last pen for tonight. This is a Pilot E pen from Japan. I have two of these pens. And these are from around the 60s. It looks quite unremarkable from the outside, but I don't get pens based on their looks most of the time. I get them on their function. And that's the story here. This is a Pilot music nib, a vintage music nib. 14 karat. This is probably one of my favorite music nibs to write with. It flexes like a music nib should. It's cut flat like a music nib should. And it's not too wide. So writing music in the staves for classical music is very it's able to do that. The way to fill this pen is just with cartridges. Nothing fancy. I opt usually to well, I don't have one with me now, but I will throw a converter in here if I'm so inclined. That's an ink window. Let you check how much ink you have in the pen left. Those are backwards. To let you check how much ink is left in the pen. I currently have no way of fleshing this out, so I'll do that at another time. But the nice thing about this pen is it's concealable. It doesn't look spectacular. It doesn't look flashy or showy. It's not trying to draw attention to itself, but it's very light, which makes it not fatiguing at all to write with. And it does a beautiful job of notating music, and I don't have to think about writing music. It'll just look good immediately when I put pen to paper. And that's going to do it. Or is it? I have one bonus pen for you. And it's a special one. Are you ready? Are you still awake? If you're still awake, you get deserved with a treat. Here we go. Ridiculous, isn't it? Yes, this is a pen. This is a Japanese jumbo. A novelty pen from Japan in the 1940s. Despite what the rumors are, these are not meant for people with arthritis, like you sometimes see around on the internet now. These are just novelty pens. I've never seen one in an octagonal pattern like this. I found this for $14 at an antique shop. And I had to have it for $14. Heck yeah. Let's see what it looks like on the inside. A little lackluster, isn't it? It's just a regular number 2 size nib. Or is it? The nib that came with it, nib that came with these pens, were less than ideal. And these weren't that expensive pens at the time, and they came in a bunch of different variants. But again, these were fun pens, they're novelties. They were not meant to be taken seriously and actually be written with on a regular basis, although you could. I actually fitted a Parker duofold nib on this pen. It seemed to fit pretty well. Gave it a little bit of an upgrade. Nib wasn't doing much, sitting and doing nothing, so just threw it in this pen. The nibs that came with this were a steel gold-plated nib that had a tendency to corrode quite easily. So putting a gold nib in here was kind of a no-brainer. How you fill the pen is quite crude. You'd unscrew this. It's basically an eyedropper. But because the mouth of this is so big, you can just get the bottle and just dump ink in here. I haven't measured how much ink it actually holds, but I don't know any other pens that hold more ink than this. At least vintage pens. Well, maybe some of the extreme oversized pens do, but again, it's got, I mean, you're going to be writing with this for months. The back end unscrews, but not to fill the pen. You'll notice this little protuberance, this little rod that sticks up, and that lies flush with this little hole where the ink flows out of in there. And when it's not in use, when the pen's not in use, that rod is touching, it's basically clogging that hole, it's plugging up that hole, because you really don't want all the weight of the ink flowing down to the nib. That would be actually too much, and it would allow the pen to leak. But there's a little bit of a tiny reservoir in here that you'd have ink that holds in there. But if you wanted more ink, you'd unscrew this, and it would just kind of allow the ink to pass between the rod and the opening, the hole right there. That's kind of the idea behind that. And yes, you can post it. Isn't that something? I remember doing a writing session, maybe 20 minutes at some point, with this pen, capping it, and then transitioning over to my Parker duofold, and then just feeling how small the duofold felt, even though the duofold is a sizable pen. It was just hilarious. It just felt so small. But there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it was a long one. I might break this up into sections, to parts, so make sure we watch all of them. I hope you're sound asleep, or awake, and engaged. One of the two. I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you in the next video.